Welcome back, Highlanders. Congratulations on completing the first three chapters in our first base camp and our climb up the macroeconomic mountain. We've now conquered that section called Basic Economics by covering the economic approach or philosophy of economists, some tools that economists use or consider, and then finally supply, demand, and the market process. So in our next section entitled Macroeconomic Accounting, what we're going to be doing is focusing on calculating things that we use to measure a nation's level of productivity. So we're going to calculate things like GDP and GNP. We're going to talk a little bit about how to calculate unemployment and inflation. So this next section is really going to be good in terms of helping us understand the kinds of things that you might see in the news or media or in political debates. So for those of you who had microeconomics, this is kind of your very first different chapter. We're going to be exploring what we call this hardcore macro stuff, or what macroeconomics is all about. All right. So with that in mind, let's get into it and get into Chapter 7 called Taking the Nation's Economic Pulse. Again, the good thing about this chapter is it's going to help you understand some words that are thrown about in the news or media that is going to help you understand the state of the country a little bit better and kind of what the president or their advisors are talking about a little bit better. The kind of bad part about this chapter is that a lot of students find this chapter a little bit more difficult than the previous chapters, mostly because the definitions are incredibly specific and it's very easy to kind of get confused or lost. You have to pay very close attention to details in order to make sure that you don't mix up what these things are measuring. So with that in mind, let's get into Chapter 7. The first thing we're going to do here is define GDP, or gross domestic product. It's something I've kind of mentioned before in the past videos, but we're actually going to talk about how we calculate GDP using both the expenditure approach and the resource cost approach. And then we're going to find GNP, or gross national product. It's slightly different than our calculation for GDP, and we'll talk about what that difference is. And then in the last part of this chapter, we're going to talk about the price index and how to calculate it. And then we'll go into detail on two different price indexes, the consumer price index and the GDP deflator. And then we'll talk about some limitations of GDP, some ways in which GDP is not a perfect measure of productivity, or ways in which it fails us when trying to measure our productivity. And then finally, we'll end by talking about per capita GDP, which is just our GDP divided by population, or our GDP per person, and what that definition indicates or represents. So that's kind of where we're headed with this chapter. So let's go ahead and get it going. So gross domestic product is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country during a specific period. And we say during a specific period, it is often measured annually, so usually a year, although it is also often measured quarterly, so every 3 months. So again, I'm just going to repeat this definition. It is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country during a specific period. Now, there's a reason why this definition contains all these different colors. It's not just that I was tripping hard on something when I wrote these slides, but in reality, what we're going to do is we're going to break down this definition and again talk about what we mean by market value. Again, that's a very specific part of that definition. Then we'll talk about what we mean by final goods and services, what we mean by something being produced versus just transferred, what we mean by within a country, and then what we mean by during a specific period. So again, there's kind of 5 very specific parts to this particular definition, and you have to know what those specific parts mean in order to kind of understand what goes into our calculation of GDP. So again, you have to pay very close attention to detail in order to understand how this stuff works. So let's start it off with market value. So when we're talking about market value, what we mean is that any goods that we produce or any services that we provide in our economy, they are weighted according to the purchase price of the good or service, right? So again, goods are weighted according to the purchase price of that good or service. So a common expression is, how do you compare apples and oranges, right? Well, the way that we do it in economics is we use a common denominator, which in our currency is the dollar, or the purchasing price of that good or service produced. Right, so the dollar is the common measure for the value of the good or service produced, and that's how we compare all these different goods when we're talking about how they contribute to GDP. Right, so in other words, when we're measuring our production in our current economy, right, in order to measure the production of apples, we have to multiply the number of apples we produce by the selling price of those apples. Same thing, if we are trying to measure our production of oranges, then we have to multiply the number of oranges we produce by the selling price of those oranges. And that's how we start figuring out what our total measure of production is. Now, please note that goods that are worth more are going to add more to GDP. So if the selling price of an orange is higher than the selling price of an apple, then each orange we produce will add more to GDP than each apple we produce. If the selling price of a computer is more than both apples and oranges, then every computer we produce is going to add more to GDP than those apples and oranges. Right? So again, we're measuring production. Things that cost more to produce are going to add more to GDP than things that maybe cost less to produce. And then total spending on all goods and services produced during the year would be summed up to obtain annual GDP. Again, usually it's measured annually, although again, it's often measured quarterly as well, right? So again, total spending on all the goods and services produced during the year is summed to obtain annual GDP. Let's go through and do a quick calculation to make sure we understand what we mean by market value. Right. So let's say that we are an economy that just produces apples and oranges. So this economy in the past year has produced 5 apples, and the selling price of apples is 5 cents each. This economy has also produced 5 oranges, and the selling price of oranges is 10 cents each. So let's talk about what their contributions to GDP is and calculate the total GDP for this economy. Right. So with that in mind, let's talk about these apples first. So as an economy, if we're producing 5 apples and they're being sold at 5 cents each, then our contribution to GDP from apples is going to be 25 cents. Again, just 5 apples times 5 cents each. Now, if this economy also produced 5 oranges that is selling at 10 cents each, then our contribution to GDP from oranges is going to be, again, 5 oranges times 10 cents each is a total of 50 cents. Right, so with that in mind, if we're trying to measure the total GDP for this particular economy, it's going to come out to 75 cents. So again, we notice that we've converted both of these goods into a common denominator, which is a dollar amount when we add up their contribution to GDP. Notice that oranges, which are being sold for 10 cents, which is more than what apples are being sold for at 5 cents each, are adding more to GDP than apples are, even though we produce the same amount of each. So because oranges are worth more, they're adding more to our GDP, even though we produce 5 units of oranges, just like we produced 5 units of apples. Right? So again, when we talk about market value, we convert it to a common denominator, which is usually the currency of that particular country. In the United States, that is the US dollar. And you add it up or sum it up to get total GDP. So this is an economy that produces 2 goods and 2 goods only. This is what their GDP would be. All right, so let's keep on rolling. That's what we mean by market value. Let's get into the next part of that definition. Remember, GDP is the market value of all final goods and services. So let's talk about what we mean by final goods and services. So a final good or service is a good or service that is purchased by what we call the ultimate user. I know the ultimate user sounds like a superhero or a professional wrestler, but in economics, the ultimate user is just the final person to consume that good. So for example, if you buy a loaf of bread and you eat it, then you are considered the ultimate user, right? The purchase price of that loaf of bread that you consumed and ate, that would be added to GDP. However, if you purchased that loaf of bread and then you used it to make sandwiches, and then you sold those sandwiches to other people who then consumed and ate them, then the people who ate the sandwiches would be the ultimate user. You, however, being the person who bought that loaf of bread and then added it to the production value of these sandwiches that you then sold, you would no longer be the ultimate user of that loaf of bread because you weren't the final one to consume it. And so if you buy that loaf of bread and you use it to make another product, then that loaf of bread now becomes what we call an intermediate good or service. So again, intermediate good or service are just goods that are purchased for resale or for use in producing another good or service. So again, buying a loaf of bread and eating it makes that loaf of bread a final good or service. Buying that loaf of bread and making sandwiches out of it that you then sell to somebody else, that then makes that loaf of bread an intermediate good or service. And again, only final goods and services are added to our measure for GDP. Intermediate goods and services are not added to our measure for GDP because the value of those intermediate goods and services are already capitalized into those final goods and services when they're added to GDP. Right. So let's go through another example here. Right, so another calculation, let's say that this economy again produces 5 apples that they can sell at 5 cents each, 5 oranges that they can sell at 10 cents each. But let's say that they took 3 of those apples and they made apple juice out of them and then sold those for 20 cents each. So let's go ahead and go through this calculation. So again, you might be tempted to say, well, they're producing 5 apples and those are being sold at 5 cents each. So once again, that is 25 cents. That is going to add to our GDP. They're producing 5 oranges at 10 cents each. So that's going to add 50 cents to our GDP, just like in our previous example. But then you might be thinking, hey, they took 3 of these apples and created apple juice out of them and then sold those for 20 cents each. That is an extra 60 cents. That will be added to GDP. So then if you add up our GDP, it's going to come out to $1.35. And you can look at that as the total measure of production for the economy. Now, if you did it this way, then you did it wrong. Because again, if we take 5 apples and we convert 3 of those apples into apple juice and then sell them, then the person who bought those 3 apples and converted into apple juice, those apples were now became an intermediate good, so they don't get included in the GDP at their selling price because they're already capitalized into the value of the apple juice that does get included in the GDP at 20 cents each, right? So the correct way to do this is instead of saying that we are now selling 5 apples at 5 cents each and so 25 cents gets added to GDP, right? 3 of those apples are being converted to apple juice. So we only have 2 apples that are being eaten by their ultimate user. And so the contribution to GDP of those particular apples is just the 10 cents. Right? The 5 oranges are still being consumed and eaten by their ultimate users, so that's still 50 cents. And then those 3 apples that were not consumed or eaten but converted to apple juice are still added in there at 20 cents each, or a total of 60 cents. So the real total GDP for this economy is not $1.35. Right? If you're looking at that last box there, it is $1.20. Right? So with that in mind, GDP would be overstated or 15 cents higher than it really is if you did what we call double counted those apples, count them as both an intermediate good and then the final good in terms of those being capitalized in that apple juice, right? So again, you only want to count the apples once. So the apples that are eaten and consumed by their ultimate user, that's going to get added to GDP. But then the apples that are converted to apple juice, you don't count those as they're at their original selling price because, again, the value of those apples are already capitalized or included into the value of that apple juice. Right. So make sure you understand, again, to avoid that whole idea of double counting. So again, you don't want to count the intermediate goods because their value is already contained within the final good. And again, so you got to be very careful when you're thinking about which things are being included into GDP. So let's go through an example here. Are tires an intermediate good or a final good? Well, that depends, right? If you are somebody who purchases tires and then uses those tires to produce cars and then sell those cars to people, then those tires that are part of the car are an intermediate good. You don't count the sale of those tires into GDP because they're going to be included into the final higher selling price of the car that has those tires built in. However, if you're somebody who buys a tire just so that you can use it for, say, a tire swing or an obstacle course, or maybe you want to hit it with a sledgehammer as part of an exercise, right? If you buy a tire just so that you can use it for these purposes, then the selling price of that tire would be considered a final good because it's not being capitalized into anything else that you are selling to someone else. So again, tires could be an intermediate good if they're part of a car. They could also be a final good if you buy them and then use them for another purpose that you're not selling to somebody else, right? So again, a good could be either an intermediate good or a final good, depending on how you use it and who the ultimate user is. So let's go through another example just to make sure we understand how this process works. Let's go through an example of making bread. And again, this will kind of help explain why only the final goods and services are included into GDP. Right. So going through this process, let's say that the process of making bread starts off with the farmer who's going to grow and sell the wheat. So assume that the farmer there can grow and sell his wheat for, say, 30 cents. So the revenue from the farmer that he receives for growing and selling his wheat to the miller is 30 cents. Now, the farmer, we're going to assume, already had all the seeds and everything needed to make the bread, just so we don't go too far back into this process. So the value that is added from the farmer alone is the value added of that 30 cents. In other words, if the farmer started with nothing but the things that they already had, right, they created 30 cents worth of value by growing that wheat. So then they sell the wheat to a miller. And a miller is somebody who takes wheat and pounds it and turns it into flour, right? So let's say that the miller paid the farmer 30 cents for that wheat. So the cost to the miller is, again, that 30 cents of obtaining that wheat. But then they go ahead and turn that wheat into flour, and then they sell that flour to the baker for, say, 65 cents. So the revenue the miller receives is, again, that 65 cents, right? So how much value did the miller add in terms of this production process? Well, they bought the wheat for 30 cents. They turned it into flour, which they then sold to the baker for 65 cents. So the miller has added 35 cents worth of value. All right, so the baker has bought this flour now for 65 cents. Right, now what the baker does is they take that flour and they add some stuff to it and turn it into bread. Right, so they cook that flour with some other ingredients and make bread out of it. And let's say that the baker can sell that bread to the grocer, or the person who runs the grocery store, for, say, 90 cents. So the revenue the baker receives is 90 cents, right? So again, they bought $65 cents worth of stuff, and they turned it into stuff that is worth 90 cents. So the baker has added 25 cents worth of value as part of this production process. All right. So the baker then sells this loaf of bread to the grocer for that 90 cents. So the cost to the grocer of obtaining this loaf of bread is 90 cents. And the grocer puts it in a store that's very convenient for you to go and get it with all your other items. And in order to pay for that convenience, they mark up the loaf of bread to, say, $1, which is the price that you as a consumer might pay for it and then consume that loaf of bread. So again, they bought it for 90 cents. They put it in the store to sell to the customers for $1. So the value added from the grocer is 10 cents. Right. So again, if you're calculating GDP and you are double counting stuff, then you might be tempted to just add up the revenue that each person receives, or again, the selling price of this good all the way along the steps of this production process. If you do that, then that's going to come out to $2.85. All right, so 30 plus 65 cents is 95 cents, plus another 90 cents is $1.85, plus another dollar is $2.85, right? So you might be tempted to, again, add up the sales price of all these ingredients along the way, and $2.85 is what your total revenue would be. You'd be like, well, that's what should be added to GDP, right? But in reality, again, we're just focused on adding up the value added, or again, looking at the final good or service. So if you add up the value added, right, then that's going to be 30 cents plus 35 cents, which is 65 cents, plus another 25 cents comes out to 90 cents, plus another 10 cents comes out to $1, which, if you notice, is going to be the difference between the revenue and then the cost of these ingredients along the way. So if you add up the cost, you're going to get $1.85. So the revenues minus the cost equals that value added. And notice that the value added is going to be the same thing as the selling price of that good to the ultimate user. Right. So again, the reason why we are focusing on the final good or service, or the selling price of the good to the ultimate user who then consumes and eats it, is because that is really just the sum of the value added to this product all along the steps of the production process. And so if we're trying to measure the amount of things being produced in a society, it's the value added that we care about or are focused on, right? So again, if you buy that loaf of bread from the grocer and eat it, and you buy it at a price of $1, then it's just that $1 that is going to be added to GDP during this particular period in which it's being measured, or again, the sum of that value added. Now, once again, if you were to buy that loaf of bread and make sandwiches out of it and then sell those sandwiches to somebody else, then that would be another step along this production process chain. And again, you'd have to add the value added of that step into the final selling price of the sandwich, which again, if consumed or eaten, then it's the selling price of the sandwich that would be included in the GDP, not the selling price of the loaf of bread. But if we stop at the loaf of bread and somebody consumes and eats that, then again, that loaf of bread becomes a final good or service. And so that's what gets added to GDP. So again, hopefully that makes sense. Make sure that you understand that it is the final goods and services that are being added to GDP, not the intermediate goods or services along the way, because then you're going to end up double counting those goods or services. So let's go ahead and keep on rocking here, moving forward. So remember, our definition for GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced. So let's talk about what we mean by being produced or production. So only goods and services that are produced are included into GDP. Transfers are not. And transfers are when you take something from one person and give it to somebody else, either voluntarily or through coercion. But again, that's not anything being produced, that's just something being transferred, and that does not get included into GDP. So only production gets included, transfers are not. So what are some examples of transfers? So again, these are things that would not be counted into GDP. Right. Well, if you are graduating this year from college and your grandmother gives you a $100 check as a graduation gift, that's not included into GDP, even though money is changing hands, right? That's a gift. It's something that's being transferred from one person to another. There's not anything that's being produced there. Now, if your grandmother, say, walked some dogs or did some babysitting or provided a good or service that allowed her to obtain that $100, well, then the value of that good or service would be included in GDP, but the act of giving that $100 to you as a graduation gift or a birthday gift or any other kind of gift, right, that wouldn't be included into GDP, right? So again, transfers are not included. All right, so keep that in mind. Right. Transfer payments from the government are not included in the GDP either, right? So again, if the government is paying somebody to perform a good or service, so if they're paying a soldier or if they're paying a police officer, then that would be included in GDP. But if the government is taking money from one group of people and giving it to another group of people, that is not included in the GDP, again, even though money is changing hands. Right, so any welfare payments, which are payments where the government takes money from people above a certain income level and gives it to people below a certain income level, right, those are not included in the GDP because nothing is being produced. Right. Unemployment benefits, where the government takes money from people who are paying unemployment taxes or people who are working and giving them to people who are collecting unemployment benefits or people who are not working. Again, that is, there's nothing being produced there, so those unemployment benefits would not be included into GDP. Social Security payments, which are when the government takes money from people who are below a certain age and gives it to people who are above a certain age. Again, nothing's being produced there, so that is not included into GDP anywhere. Right, so again, some of you might have recently gotten a stimulus check in response to the COVID-19 outbreak. Right, that stimulus check, again, nothing's being produced there, so that is not being included into GDP. So again, if we are paying somebody to perform a good or service, right, then that is included, but welfare, unemployment benefits, Social Security, any kind of transfers are not. Right. And then finally, any financial transactions are not included into GDP. So if you buy, say, 10 shares of AT&T stock at a price of $100 per share, then that is you paying $1,000 in order to obtain those 10 shares of stock. But that's not anything being produced, that's just a transfer, right? You are now transferring some money in exchange for ownership over AT&T, but there's no production happening there. So that transaction would not be included into GDP anywhere. However, excuse me, the sales commission, if there was any on that exchange, would be counted into GDP. So if you paid, say, a stockbroker a $7 sales commission on that exchange, then the $7 only would be included in the GDP because that is now a service that is being produced, right? So the transaction itself is not being included, or the value of that transaction itself is not being included, unless you pay a broker or dealer to help you perform that transaction. Then that is a service that is being provided. That is something that is being produced. So just the value of that service alone would be counted, right? So again, if you pay, say, $1,007, right, in order to buy 10 shares of AT&T stock at a price of $100 per share, and again paid at $7 in sales commission, so you paid $1,007 to make that transaction happen. Only the $7 that represents the service being produced at this point in time, right? Only that $7 is included in the GDP. The $1,000, which just represents the transfer of stock, that is not being included into GDP. Because again, nothing is being produced with that transfer. All right, so kind of keep that stuff in mind. Again, if you're playing cards with your friends and you say make $50 at the end of the night from playing cards with your friends, if that's the total of your winnings, and you're not including that anywhere on your tax returns because it was just a kind of night with your friends rather than something you do professionally, then that wouldn't be included anywhere into GDP either. So just kind of keep that stuff in mind, right? Again, that's just kind of money being transferred without necessarily a service being produced or performed in the marketplace, right? So only goods and services that are produced are included in GDP. Again, transfers are not. So continuing on here, GDP counts only goods and services produced within the geographic borders of a country. So again, for revisiting our definition of GDP, it is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country is the fourth part of that definition. So what we mean by within a country is that GDP counts only the goods and services produced within the geographic borders of a country. So it doesn't matter what the citizenship or nationality is of the person who's producing it. If it's happening within the geographic borders of a country, that is included into that country's GDP. Right? So if, say, some Japanese individuals come over to the United States to produce Japanese cars by opening up a factory in the United States, so it doesn't matter whether all the workers or owners or materials are from Japan. If it is being produced within the geographic borders of the United States, then that is included into US GDP. It would not be included into Japanese GDP because it's not happening within the geographic borders of Japan. By the same token, if the United States, a company in the United States like Nike opens up a shoe factory in Indonesia, right, even if they staff it with US workers or even if they staff it with Indonesia workers, it doesn't matter if that factory is located in Indonesia, right, then the production of those shoes are not being included into US GDP. They are being included into Indonesia's GDP, right? So again, if the production is happening in the geographic borders of the country, then and only then is it being included into that country's GDP. So a factory owned by US citizens that is operating in another country would not be included into US GDP. A factory that is owned by foreign citizens that is being, where the stuff is being produced within the borders of the United States, that would be included into US GDP. So it has to, again, be happening within the borders of a country to be included into that country's GDP. All right, so let's move on to the final part of this definition, right? So remember, GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country, and then the final part is during a specific period. So what do we mean by during a specific period? Let's talk about that part of the definition. So again, only goods produced in, say, the year 2020 would be included into the figure for 2020's GDP. So if they were produced in 2019, but they weren't sold till 2020, then they aren't included in the 2020's GDP because they've already been included into 2019's GDP. And again, we want to try to avoid double counting as much as possible. So it has to be produced within the year or the period being measured to be included in that year or that period's GDP. Right? So with that in mind, if a car is produced in 2005 and then resold in the year 2020, then that wouldn't affect 2020's GDP at all because it was already added into 2005's GDP when it was produced during that year. Right now, if the seller in 2020 did something to fix up that car, like they refurbished it, they maybe got a new paint job, or they maybe did a oil change, or maybe they changed the transmission fluid. If they did something to improve that car in 2020 before they sold it, then the value of those improvements would be included into 2020's GDP, because those are goods being produced or services being performed in that year. So if the seller fixes it up in 2020 and them being able to fix it up, or them fixing it up allows them to sell it for more money, then the increased value of that car would be included in GDP, in the 2020's GDP. Right. And that brings us to probably one of the most complicated issues, at least for students. They tend to ask the most questions about this. What about houses, right? So let's say a house was produced in the year 2000. Well, because it was produced in the year 2000, it will be added to 2000's GDP, right? So whatever the value of that house is when it was produced in the year 2000, it is already added it into the year 2000's GDP. Now, if that house is resold in, say, 2020, then it would not be added to 2020's GDP, because again, the value of that production was already included into 2000's GDP when it was originally produced. Now, a lot of people ask, well, yeah, but what if the market value of that home increases, right? In other words, it's sold in 2020 for a lot more money than it was sold in the year 2000 just because property values have increased. Well, again, that's not a measure of production necessarily. And again, it's production I want you to focus on, not necessarily the selling price. So just because property values increase, that doesn't mean that that house, even though it's sold for more money, right, is going to be included into 2020's GDP. Now, if you did something to that house in 2020 to increase the value of it, if you say added a room, or if you painted it, or if you repaired the roof, if you put granite countertops in the kitchen, if you added solar panels, if you did something before you sold that before you sold that house that increased the selling price of that house, well then again, the value of the production of those improvements would be included into, say, 2020's GDP, right? But just the value of the improvements alone, right? So again, the value of the improvements that are capitalized in the final selling price of that home, that would be included in GDP. But the original selling price of the home would not, right? So again, it's kind of leaves some room for a lot of tricky stuff to happen. So I want to make sure you understand, again, what gets included and what doesn't. So again, if a house is bought in 2005 and then it is resold in 2020, even if it's resold at a higher price, but no improvements have been made in the year 2020, then it will not add to 2020's GDP. But if you did make improvements in the year 2020, then the value of those improvements alone would be added to 2020's GDP. Now, if you bought a house in 2005 and then you moved in 2020, but you kept that house and then rented it out to somebody and acted as their landlord, well, now that is a service that is being performed in 2020. So the rent that is being paid on that home in 2020 by the tenant, that would be included into 2020's GDP. So reselling a house that was produced in a previous period, right, again, won't add to GDP unless you've done any improvements to it. But renting out a house that was produced in a previous period, because you are now performing a service as a landlord during that period, the value of that service being performed would be included, right, in that year's GDP. So again, that's what I mean when I say you got to be very careful when you start answering questions here, because again, there's a lot of things that are very specific to this definition. And part of what you're going to need to know when you're answering questions on quizzes and exams are indeed what is included into GDP and what is not. So let's go through a couple of these practice questions to make sure you got it. So our first practice question here for Chapter 7 says if a used car dealer purchases a used car for $3,000 and then they refurbish it or fix it up, again, improve it in some kind of way and sell it for $8,000, then how is that going to affect GDP, right? Is it A, that the dealer contributes a value added equal to $5,000 but nothing is added to GDP? Is it B, that the dealer contributes value added equal to $5,000 and consequently $5,000 is added to GDP? Is it C, that the dealer contributes nothing to production because only existing goods are involved? Or is it D, that the dealer contributes value added equal to $8,000 but only $5,000 is added to GDP? So again, this is where you got to focus on production and not selling price. And again, we'll talk about what gets added during this period. So if they purchase a used car for $3,000, well, the value of that car was already included into a previous year's GDP. And then they fix it up or add some value to it so that they can sell it for $8,000. Then the answer is B, the dealer contributes value added equal to $8,000, and therefore only the $5,000 is added to GDP. So even though they sold it for $8,000, it's only the $5,000 that's being added in value for this particular period that gets included into this period's GDP. Right. So again, B is the answer you are looking for on this one. Right. Let's check out a different one. Again, make sure that we can do these types of questions. So this question says, which of the following transactions would be included into this year's GDP? Is it A, Joe Exotic purchases a 5-year-old house from Doc Antle? Is it B, Joe Exotic rents a 5-year-old house from Doc Antle? Is it C, that Joe Exotic purchases 100 shares of AT&T stock from Doc Antle, although assume there's no sales commission on this trade? Or is it D, that Joe Exotic purchases an antique, probably a tiger cage, at Doc Antle's garage sale? Right, so again, if you're looking at these choices, right, Joe Exotic purchasing a 5-year-old house from Doc Antle, again, unless there's something in the answer choice that says that Doc Antle improved that house during this particular time period, then that will not be included into this year's GDP because it was already included into the GDP from 5 years ago when that house was produced. Right? Now, Joe Exotic renting a 5-year-old house from Doc Antle, that now makes Doc Antle a landlord that's providing a service to Joe Exotic as a tenant. So the value of that service would be included into this year's GDP. So B is definitely the right answer there. Just looking at C here, Joe Exotic purchasing 100 shares of AT&T stock from Doc Antle. Again, that is a financial transaction where nothing is being produced, especially if there's no sales commission on this trade. So that would not be included in GDP. Now, if I told you that Doc Antle collected, say, a $10 sales commission on the trade, then again, the value of that $10, only that sales commission, which is a service being performed in this period, only that would be included into this period's GDP. And then Joe Exotic purchasing an antique at Doc Antle's garage sale. Well, again, antiques are things that are produced in previous periods, so that wouldn't be included into this year's GDP at all, because again, the value of that antique would have already been included into the previous year's GDP, the year in which that antique was produced. So B is the answer you're looking for on this one. So again, there's going to be questions like this on your quiz or exam. Make sure you know which transactions are being included in GDP and which ones are not. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and move on a little bit. So there are two ways to measure GDP. One is called the expenditure approach, and the other is called the resource cost income approach. Right, so both approaches should give you the same number if you do them correctly. So either way you do it, you should be able to calculate the same number. It's just two different sides of the equation. The expenditure approach focuses on, again, expenditures or things that we are paying out, or money that's being paid out in our economy. The resource cost income approach is, again, focused on income or the amount of money that's being collected by somebody in the economy. So again, you're going to have money going out, you're going to have money collected. It should be the same once you total everything up, again, assuming you've done it correctly. Now, as far as this class is concerned, the expenditure approach is the one that we're going to be focused on most. So we're going to spend the most time on that. That one I want you to know like the back of your hand. The resource cost income approach is something that I'm going to ask you to be able to recognize if you see it on the exam, but I'm not going to ask you to spend too much time calculating it or going through it. Right, I just want you to be able to recognize it in case you see it in future economics classes. Right, so with that in mind, this is where we're going to stop for part 1 of Chapter 7. We're going to pick it up with our second lecture video for Chapter 7 with this slide, and we're going to go through in a very careful and tedious way how to calculate the expenditure approach, because again, that's going to be coming back around in all of our future chapters. Right. So with that in mind, that is it for part 1. Let me know if you have any questions. As always, you can either shoot me an email or come see me during my Zoom office hours. I hope you understood everything that happened in part 1, but if not, again, just let me know if you need anything, and I'll see you all next time for part 2 of Chapter 7. Until then, stay safe and healthy, take care, and again, let me know if there's anything I can do for you at all. See you next time.